I'm Emily Thompson, 29, and I grew up in a small suburban town in Ohio thinking that my life was ordinary. My mother, a woman of soft smiles and strict rules, always claimed that she did everything for me, that she sacrificed everything to give me a normal life. On the surface, that sounded true. We had a cozy home, a routine, birthdays celebrated with balloons and cake, and summers at the lake. But beneath the warmth, there was a tension I could never name, a quiet nervousness in her eyes, a hesitation in her voice whenever I asked about my father or our family history. I remember the afternoon I discovered the truth like it happened yesterday. I was 29, married, living in my own apartment in the city. My mother had passed away a few months prior, leaving me with a box of letters, photographs, and old documents she'd kept hidden in the attic. The box smelled faintly of cedar and dust, carrying the weight of decades of secrets. I had been digging through it to find some keepsakes, a photograph, maybe a letter she had written me as a child, but what I found instead made me freeze. It was an envelope, yellowed with age, sealed but with a corner ripped open. Written in a shaky, almost illegible hand was the word, "Adoption Papers." My hands trembled as I pulled out the documents. My mother, the woman who had tucked me in at night, who had kissed my scraped knees and celebrated every milestone, had hidden this from me my entire life. I stared at the pages, the legal jargon suddenly screaming truths my heart had never dared imagine. I was not her biological daughter. Shock hit me first, a visceral, stomach-turning kind of disbelief. I remember sitting on the attic floor, the papers clutched to my chest, wondering how this could have happened. I felt a strange mix of betrayal and sorrow. Everything I had believed about my life, about my identity, suddenly felt like a carefully constructed illusion. Questions raced through my mind like a storm I couldn't control. Why had she hidden this? Who were my real parents? And most importantly, why hadn't she trusted me with the truth? As I sank into the chaos of my emotions, I remembered a conversation from my childhood. I had been maybe 8 or 9, sitting on the couch beside my mother while she cleaned the kitchen, and I had asked her casually about my father. Her hand had trembled over the dishcloth. He's someone from a past I can't talk about, she had said, her voice low, almost whispering. At the time, I didn't understand. I had accepted the vagueness as normal adult secrecy. But now, I realized that the shadows in her eyes were warnings, little cracks in the carefully painted life she had built for me. After the initial shock, fear began to creep in. What if the man she had feared, whoever he was, found me? What if he was dangerous, or angry, or somehow blamed me for circumstances I didn't even know existed? I remembered how Mother used to flinch whenever someone mentioned him, how she would change the subject, how she would tighten her grip on my hand. There was a story there, a story she had shielded me from, and now I was holding the missing pieces in my trembling hands. I spent the next hours reading and rereading the adoption papers, searching for names, addresses, anything that could point me to the man who was, apparently, my father. My heart pounded as I absorbed the fact that my mother had been protecting me from him, or at least trying to. The papers contained legal details, birth names, and a reference to a wealthy family in New York, a name that had passed through my mind vaguely in conversation with my mother over the years, but never fully registered. Jonathan Carlyle. The name alone sent a shiver down my spine. Jonathan Carlyle, a man my mother had described once as a complicated figure she had known before I was born. She had always spoken of him with a mixture of fear and regret. I remembered snippets of overheard phone conversations when I was a teenager, moments when she would whisper in hurried tones about debts, disputes, and threats. I had never understood then, but now the pieces began to form a picture that was terrifying and tantalizing all at once. Over the next few days, I hesitated, paralyzed by both fear and curiosity. The logical part of me screamed to leave well enough alone. He was a man I had never met, and the stories surrounding him were clouded with caution and dread. But another part of me, a part that had always felt a yearning for identity, for understanding, for answers, could not resist. I needed to know who I was, where I came from, and why my mother had carried the burden of keeping me from him for so long. Then, As if fate had been listening, the phone rang. I answered with a shaking hand, expecting telemarketers or mundane calls. But the voice on the other end froze me in place. "Emily Thompson?" A deep, calm voice asked. "This is Jonathan Carlyle. I believe I found my daughter. My heiress." Time stopped. Every breath caught in my throat. My mother's worst fear, the man who had haunted the peripheries of my life, was speaking to me directly, calling me something I had never imagined myself to be: his heir, his child, his responsibility. The words were both shocking and intoxicating. I felt a strange blend of anger at my mother, awe at the man's presence, even if only through a phone call, and an unexpected rush of curiosity and longing for connection. I spent the night replaying the conversation in my mind, trying to understand the implications. What did this mean for my life? For the inheritance, yes, but more importantly, for my sense of self? For the first time in nearly 3 decades, I realized that I was standing at the edge of a world my mother had shielded me from, and I had to decide whether to step in or step back. The next morning, I made a decision. I would meet him. I would confront the past my mother had hidden so fiercely, and I would learn the truth directly from the source. I dressed carefully, my hands still trembling with anticipation, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. For the first time, I felt the weight of adult choice, of control over a destiny that had been decided for me in secret. The girl who had trusted blindly, who had lived quietly in her mother's shadow, was no longer the only Emily in the story. A new chapter had begun, one with stakes I could hardly comprehend. And so, with a mixture of fear, anger, and undeniable curiosity, I stepped out into the crisp morning air, clutching the adoption papers like a talisman. I didn't yet know what awaited me, whether it would be confrontation, betrayal, or some twisted reunion. But I knew one thing: the truth would no longer remain hidden. And for the first time, I felt the intoxicating, terrifying weight of possibility resting squarely in my own hands. The drive to New York felt surreal. My chest tightened, my mind whirring with a mix of dread, anticipation, and curiosity. I had spent my entire life constructing an identity shaped by my mother's choices, her stories, and the home she built around me. And yet, with each passing mile, the weight of the secret I now carried pressed harder, as if the road itself were reminding me that I was stepping into a world I had been deliberately kept from. I kept the adoption papers folded carefully in my bag, their edges worn from hours of handling. I reread them once more while sitting in the back seat of the cab I'd called from the airport, trying to absorb names, addresses, dates, anything that could anchor me to the reality I was about to confront. I knew little of Jonathan Carlyle beyond what my mother had whispered in fleeting conversations and the skeletal outline provided in the documents. Wealthy, influential, private, he was a figure larger than life, yet entirely unknown to me. As I approached his address, a towering townhouse in the Upper East Side, I felt my pulse accelerate. The streets were bustling, filled with people who moved with a sense of purpose and confidence that made my nerves flare in response. I had grown up in a quiet suburb, the kind of town where neighbors knew each other by name, and suddenly I was navigating a world that seemed entirely designed for people who never had to question their place in it. The doorman greeted me with a polite nod, and I hesitated at the threshold, suddenly uncertain if I was ready for what awaited inside. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the marble-floored lobby, the air tinged with faint scent of polished wood and fresh flowers. Everything about the building radiated wealth and control, a sharp contrast to the modest home I had known my entire life. My mother's warnings echoed in my head. Careful, she had said, careful with people like him. And yet, here I was, drawn by an invisible thread of truth and curiosity I couldn't resist. Minutes later, I was ushered into a large study where he waited. Jonathan Carlyle was nothing like I had imagined. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with neatly combed silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to pierce through layers of pretense. But there was an unmistakable warmth in his gaze, a gentleness that contradicted the formidable reputation that had preceded him in my mother's stories. He rose from his chair, extending a hand with a quiet confidence that demanded attention but not fear. Emily, he said, his voice steady, calm, yet carrying a weight that made it clear he had waited a long time for this moment. I've been told you're my daughter, my heiress. I've been hoping we'd meet one day, and now here you are. I nodded, words catching in my throat. I wanted to respond, to demand explanations, to voice the anger and betrayal I felt toward my mother for hiding this from me for nearly 3 decades. But the sight of him, the undeniable reality of the man who had been a ghost in my life, rendered me momentarily speechless. He gestured to a chair across from his desk, and I sat, still clutching the adoption papers. I understand this is a lot to take in, he said gently. Your mother was cautious. She feared the consequences of our connection. I respect that she protected you, but it's time for the truth. You deserve to know everything. For the next several hours, he told me stories about my birth, about my mother's choices, about the tangled web of circumstances that had led her to hide the adoption from me. Each revelation cut deeper, a mix of sorrow and relief washing over me. I learned that my mother had indeed acted out of love, shielding me from conflicts and family tensions that could have endangered my childhood. Yet the deception, no matter how protective, left me feeling betrayed. How could the woman who had nurtured me with such devotion also withhold the most fundamental truth of my existence? He spoke of his life, his successes and failures, and the wealth and influence that had defined him. He spoke with a humility that surprised me, revealing a side of him that my mother had described in fragmented warnings. He was powerful, yes, but not unfeeling. He acknowledged the mistakes he had made, the choices that had forced my mother to keep me from him, and the regret he had carried for decades without ever imposing himself on my life. As we spoke, I realized that this meeting was not only about discovering my heritage, but also about confronting the complex layers of love, fear, and sacrifice that had shaped the people I thought I knew. I felt a mixture of resentment toward my mother for her secrecy and compassion for the fear that had guided her decisions. At the same time, I couldn't help but feel a sense of connection with this man I had never known, a connection that transcended years of absence and secrecy. By the time our conversation ended, I felt a strange equilibrium settling over me. I wasn't angry anymore, not fully. I wasn't entirely comfortable either, not yet. But for the first time, I felt empowered by knowledge, by truth, by the tangible understanding of where I came from and who I was meant to be. I realized that my life had shifted irrevocably in a single afternoon, and that the choices I made next would define not just my identity, but my future as well. Before leaving, he placed a hand gently on my shoulder. Emily, he said, this is just the beginning. You have every right to decide what role I play in your life. And whatever you choose, know that you are always welcome. You are my daughter, my heiress, and you have my respect, no matter what path you take. Walking back to the taxi that would take me to my hotel, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, awe, sorrow, and cautious hope. I had faced the man my mother had feared, uncovered a legacy I had never known, and glimpsed a future brimming with possibilities. The city lights glimmered around me, and for the first time, I felt as though the world I had been shielded from was not a place of danger, but of potential, if I had the courage to claim it. That night, I lay awake thinking about the choices my mother had made, the life she had built for me, and the life that now awaited me. I realized that understanding and compassion could coexist with the anger and betrayal I felt. The path to healing, I knew, would be complicated, but it would begin with knowledge, and with the courage to embrace the truths that had been hidden from me for so long. The days following my meeting with Jonathan Carlyle were a whirlwind of reflection, confusion, and planning. I returned to my apartment in Ohio feeling both empowered and destabilized. Every corner of my life seemed different now, reframed by the truths I had uncovered. My mother's secrecy had shaped my childhood, but it could no longer dictate my future. I kept thinking about her intentions, the love that had motivated her, yet also the fear that had kept me from the man who now wanted to know me. I spent the next morning revisiting the box of letters and documents my mother had left behind. As I sifted through her notes, photographs, and legal papers, I saw her in a new light. She had carried a burden I could never have imagined, and it had cost her dearly. But as much as I understood her motives, I could not ignore the years of confusion, the identity questions, the silent longing I had carried for a father I didn't know. My emotions twisted into a complex mixture of gratitude, sadness, and frustration. One photograph caught my eye, a picture of my mother standing next to a man I now recognized as Jonathan, both much younger, smiling hesitantly at the camera. There was a tension in their expressions, a sense of circumstances forcing smiles when perhaps neither felt entirely comfortable. I traced the outlines of his face, noting the familiar sharpness of his features, the same blue eyes that had met mine so calmly in that study. I imagined the story behind the photograph, the decisions, the threats, the choices that had led my mother to hide the truth about me. I decided to reach out to Jonathan again. I couldn't ignore the connection I felt, the pull of a life I had never experienced. Sending a careful email, I introduced myself more fully, expressing my curiosity and the need to understand him and the circumstances that had shaped my existence. Within hours, he replied, inviting me to meet him again in New York, promising an honest conversation about the life I had been denied until now. As I booked my flight, I felt a mixture of fear and anticipation. Traveling to a city so vast and unfamiliar felt symbolic of the journey I was undertaking, not just physically, but emotionally. This wasn't just about discovering a parent I had never known. It was about reclaiming parts of myself that had been hidden, untangling the web of secrecy, and navigating the murky waters of trust and identity. Upon arriving in New York, I was greeted by the bustling energy of the city, the honking taxis, the crowded sidewalks, the relentless movement of people who seemed to belong to the world in a way I had never quite experienced. Stepping into the townhouse once again, I felt a sense of purpose I had never known. This was my opportunity to claim agency, to confront truths, and perhaps to find the family I had been denied. Jonathan welcomed me with a calm, reassuring smile. "Emily," he said, "I'm glad you're here. I know this is overwhelming, but I want you to feel free to ask anything, to explore whatever you need." His tone was gentle, devoid of the formality I had expected, making it easier for me to open up. We spent the day walking through his personal archives, photographs, letters, and documents that traced my mother's life, his own, and the circumstances surrounding my birth. Each revelation brought a surge of emotion. I learned that my mother had fought for years to protect me from familial conflicts and financial entanglements, that she had refused offers and pressured Jonathan to leave me out of his affairs until I was of age. Her actions, while deceptive, had been protective, a paradox that left me both grateful and resentful. Jonathan spoke candidly about his mistakes, his absence, and the legal complexities that had forced him into silence. I saw not a villain, but a flawed, human figure who had made decisions with consequences he had not fully anticipated. He expressed a desire to know me, not merely as a biological connection, but as an individual deserving of recognition, respect, and choice. The sincerity in his voice struck a chord deep within me. By evening, I felt the first inklings of reconciliation, not with my mother, whose secrecy had caused pain, but with the reality of my life, and with Jonathan, whose presence represented both unknown challenges and untapped opportunities. I realized that anger alone could not shape my future. Understanding, patience, and deliberate choice were the tools I needed to navigate this new reality. Later, as we dined quietly in his study, I reflected on the distance between the life I had known and the one unfolding before me. The luxury surrounding me was foreign, yet the emotional landscape, questions of trust, identity, and belonging, was all too familiar. I found myself asking Jonathan about his vision for our relationship, his hopes for how I would navigate the legacy he had been unable to share until now. He looked at me with those piercing blue eyes and said softly, "Emily, this is your life. The past is a story we can understand, but the future is yours to claim. I only hope to be part of it in whatever way you allow." His words, simple and sincere, resonated more than any legal document or financial disclosure could. They were an invitation to choose, to shape my life on my terms, to embrace both the truth of my adoption and the possibilities of my inheritance. I left that evening feeling an unfamiliar blend of relief, clarity, and purpose. For the first time, I saw my mother's actions not merely as a betrayal, but as a shield, flawed, imperfect, but born of love. And I saw Jonathan not just as the man my mother had feared, but as a person willing to meet me in honesty and openness. The complexity of human relationships, the intertwining of fear, love, and regret, became clearer to me than ever before. Returning to my hotel, I sat by the window and gazed at the skyline, contemplating the path ahead. I realized that the next step was mine alone, to integrate this newfound knowledge, to reconcile with the past, and to define my future. My mother had hidden my adoption papers to protect me. Jonathan had stepped forward to claim his role in my life, and I stood in the middle, tasked with navigating the intricate balance of trust, love, and self-determination. Sleep came slowly that night, my mind replaying conversations, photographs, and documents. I understood, perhaps for the first time, that identity was not merely a question of biology or inheritance. It was the sum of choices, the courage to confront truth, and the willingness to embrace complexity. I felt a growing resolve within me, a determination to approach this new chapter not with fear, but with deliberate, conscious engagement. In the quiet of that evening, I made a silent vow. I would honor my mother's love, confront the realities of the life she had kept from me, and meet Jonathan as both a father and a fellow human being navigating the consequences of past mistakes. It was a commitment to balance, empathy, and empowerment, a recognition that betrayal and love could coexist in the same narrative. By the time I returned to sleep, a subtle shift had occurred within me. I was no longer just Emily Thompson, the girl who had lived under the careful watch of a protective mother. I was Emily Thompson, the woman poised to claim her place in a complex family legacy, armed with knowledge, guided by understanding, and strengthened by the courage to face truths long hidden. The journey ahead would be difficult, layered with emotion and challenges, but for the first time, I felt ready. The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, research, and reflection. I immersed myself in understanding the Carlyle legacy, both the history and the wealth that had been withheld from me, and the network of connections that Jonathan had carefully navigated over decades. Every document I reviewed, every photograph I examined, revealed another layer of my mother's fears and Jonathan's long-held intentions. What had begun as a shocking discovery had evolved into a journey of self-discovery, with each revelation reshaping the contours of my identity. Jonathan had invited me to spend time in New York, to explore the city, and to meet some of the people who had shaped his life. I was hesitant at first. The city felt overwhelming, and I was acutely aware that every step I took was colored by the knowledge that my mother had shielded me from this world for reasons she had deemed protective. But I knew I could not remain on the sidelines. I needed to see this life firsthand, to understand the man who had once been a stranger and now claimed a paternal bond with me. Walking through his townhouse, I noticed the contrast between the opulent surroundings and Jonathan's understated demeanor. He did not flaunt wealth or power. He simply existed within it, moving with a quiet authority that spoke of confidence and experience. As we walked through rooms filled with art, rare books, and carefully curated photographs, I realized that my mother had likely feared the very force that now welcomed me so calmly. Jonathan shared stories of his childhood, his rise in the business world, and the circumstances that had kept him from seeking me earlier. He spoke candidly about mistakes and missed opportunities, of the legal and social pressures that had dictated his absence. Listening to him, I began to understand the complexity of the choices my mother had made. She had protected me from potential harm, from political and financial conflicts that could have ensnared a child. Yet, in doing so, she had withheld my birthright, my history, and my connection to a father I never knew. One afternoon, we took a quiet walk through Central Park. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and the sound of children playing in the distance reminded me of my own childhood, moments I had cherished, yet had never fully understood in the context of the family I now belonged to. Jonathan spoke of his regrets, of the years lost, and the burden he had carried, knowing that I had grown up without him. I saw sincerity in his words, a vulnerability that humanized the man I had imagined as untouchable, distant, and formidable. As we walked, I asked him about my mother, about her fears and motivations. He listened patiently as I voiced both my gratitude and my anger, my sorrow and my curiosity. "She loved you," he said finally. "And sometimes love is messy. Protective love can look like secrecy, and secrecy can feel like betrayal. But she did what she thought was best for you." His words resonated, echoing the duality of my emotions. I felt a strange reconciliation with my mother, recognizing that her choices were rooted in love, even if those choices had caused pain. The days that followed were filled with introductions to lawyers, advisors, and friends who had known Jonathan and respected him for decades. Each interaction was a lesson in patience, observation, and understanding. I noticed the subtle ways he commanded respect without demanding it, the quiet authority in his decisions, and the empathy he extended toward those around him. In this environment, I began to see the possibilities that had been kept from me, not just material wealth, but a deeper understanding of who I was and the potential to shape my own life. I also began to confront the more uncomfortable emotions, the betrayal, the questions of why my mother had hidden the truth for so long, and the implications of a life lived without full knowledge of my heritage. In late-night reflections, I realized that I could no longer dwell solely on anger or resentment. Instead, I needed to navigate a path that honored my mother's intentions, acknowledged Jonathan's role, and asserted my autonomy as an adult capable of making informed choices. One evening, as the city lights shimmered through the townhouse windows, Jonathan and I spoke about the future. He expressed a desire for connection, not control, for understanding, not obligation. "Emily," he said softly, "you have every right to claim or reject this life as you see fit. My role is to offer, not impose. I hope we can build something genuine, something meaningful, but it must be on your terms." His words empowered me, highlighting the freedom and responsibility I now held. Over the following week, I began to explore parts of my identity that had been hidden for years. I visited offices, charities, and social circles that Jonathan had navigated, observing without judgment, learning without expectation. Each experience offered insight into both his life and my potential place within it. I realized that while the discovery of my adoption had been jarring, it also opened doors I had never imagined, doors that offered both opportunity and understanding. Yet, amidst the excitement and exploration, the underlying tension remained. How would I reconcile the mother who had hidden the truth with the father who had only just found me? Could I integrate these seemingly opposing forces into a coherent understanding of myself? The questions lingered, heavy but necessary, as I navigated the delicate balance between love, trust, and self-determination. In quiet moments, I revisited my childhood memories with new perspective. The birthday parties, the vacations, the simple evenings reading with my mother all took on nuanced meaning. I saw her fear, her protective instincts, her sacrifices. And I saw myself, resilient, curious, and ready to claim the parts of life that had been withheld. The interplay of betrayal and love, secrecy and protection, became a complex tapestry I could finally begin to understand and navigate. By the end of my stay, I felt a subtle transformation within myself. I was no longer just the girl who had grown up under my mother's careful guidance. I was Emily Thompson, a woman with agency, insight, and the power to engage with a past that had shaped me, yet no longer defined me. I had met the man my mother had feared, explored the legacy I had been kept from, and begun the process of integrating these truths into a life I could now call my own. As I prepared to return home, Jonathan offered a parting smile, full of warmth and encouragement. "This is just the beginning," he said. "There's much to explore, many connections to build. But I'm glad we've started." And I nodded, feeling a mixture of gratitude, cautious hope, and anticipation. The journey ahead would be filled with challenges, but for the first time, I felt equipped to face them with clarity, courage, and understanding. Back home, the contrast between my familiar surroundings and the world I had just visited was striking. Ohio felt smaller, quieter, yet in some ways safer, a canvas on which I could process everything I had learned. The documents, photographs, and stories I had absorbed were no longer abstract notions. They were a living part of my life. I realized that while I had always defined myself through my mother's guidance, I now had the opportunity to redefine my identity with newfound knowledge and context. I spent hours reflecting on the moments that had shaped my childhood, the moments of joy, the moments of quiet worry, and the moments when I had felt a void I could never name. Each memory now carried dual meaning. I understood the love my mother had given, but I also recognized the intentional omission of truth. The secrecy had been protective, yes, but it had also created a barrier between me and the fuller reality of my existence. The emotional tension of gratitude and resentment warred within me, leaving me restless yet determined to make sense of it all. I decided to start documenting my journey. Writing became my tool for clarity, each sentence a bridge between the past I had known and the future I was beginning to claim. I chronicled the day I had met Jonathan, the emotions that had surged within me, and the subtle shifts in perspective I had experienced. I explored my feelings toward my mother, reflecting on her intentions and the impact of her decisions. Through writing, I could disentangle the emotions that threatened to overwhelm me, transforming confusion into insight. One afternoon, I received an unexpected email from Jonathan. He had arranged a meeting with a legal advisor, someone who could help me navigate the implications of my inheritance and the responsibilities it entailed. I hesitated at first, aware that stepping into this world meant engaging with its privileges, obligations, and public scrutiny. But the desire to understand my place, to claim agency over the life I had been denied, outweighed my fears. The meeting was intense, a combination of legal formalities, strategic discussions, and practical planning. Jonathan guided me through the complex network of assets, trusts, and business interests tied to his name. The level of detail, the scope of influence, and the careful orchestration of responsibilities impressed me. Yet what stood out most was his respect for my autonomy. He did not dictate, he did not pressure. He presented information, offered guidance, and allowed me to make decisions. This approach was unfamiliar but empowering, a stark contrast to the protective secrecy my mother had employed for decades. After the meeting, Jonathan suggested a quiet dinner at a small restaurant tucked away from the city's bustle. Over the meal, we spoke candidly about expectations, boundaries, and the possibility of forming a meaningful father-daughter relationship. His humility and thoughtfulness struck me once again, revealing a man who is both influential and grounded, capable of nurturing connection without demanding allegiance. I realized that while the past had been marked by absence and secrecy, the present offered a chance for genuine bond-building, founded on honesty and mutual respect. I also reflected on my mother's choices more deeply. I called her one evening, my voice trembling with a mix of anticipation and unresolved tension. She answered on the first ring, her tone warm but cautious. "Emily," she said softly, "I know you've met him. I hope you understand why I did what I did." I swallowed, gathering my thoughts. "I understand, Mom," I began. "But I also need to process everything, the secrecy, the reasons, and the life I never knew. I need to find my place between the love you gave and the truth I've discovered." Her sigh carried the weight of years of guilt and protection. "I only wanted to keep you safe," she whispered. "But I see now that protecting you meant hiding a part of your life. I hope you can forgive me, even as you explore this new reality." We spoke at length that night, navigating the delicate balance of apology, understanding, and reconciliation. I expressed gratitude for her love, while acknowledging the pain caused by withheld truth. She listened, occasionally crying, occasionally offering words of reassurance. By the end of the call, there was a sense of fragile understanding, a recognition that love and secrecy could coexist, yet that transparency and honesty were necessary moving forward. The following week, I returned to New York to spend more time with Jonathan. We revisited parts of his life I had yet to explore, charitable foundations, business ventures, and social initiatives that reflected his values and priorities. Observing him in these environments, I began to understand the depth of his character, his strategic mind, his empathy, and his capacity for mentorship. It became clear that this relationship was not merely about inheritance or wealth, but about guidance, support, and the potential to engage meaningfully with the world I had only glimpsed. Through these interactions, I also confronted my own ambitions. I realized that I had an opportunity not only to claim knowledge of my heritage, but to leverage it responsibly. I thought about the skills I had honed over my life, resilience, problem-solving, empathy, and how they could intersect with the resources now accessible to me. The potential to make a meaningful impact, to navigate both personal and professional spheres with intention, became increasingly tangible. Despite the excitement, I remained aware of the emotional complexity at play. Balancing the relationship with my mother, my growing connection with Jonathan, and my own emerging sense of identity required constant reflection. There were moments of doubt, moments when anger or confusion resurfaced, and moments when the enormity of the inheritance and responsibility threatened to overwhelm me. But I approached each challenge with deliberate thought, writing, reflection, and conversation guiding my decisions. One evening, Jonathan and I sat on the terrace of his townhouse, overlooking the city skyline. The lights sparkled like distant stars, a reminder of both the vastness of the world and the possibilities now open to me. We spoke quietly about the journey ahead, acknowledging the delicate balance between past mistakes, current opportunities, and future choices. "Emily," he said, "life is rarely simple, but you've demonstrated courage, insight, and the willingness to engage honestly. That will carry you far, no matter the circumstances." I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not only for Jonathan's presence, but for the lessons I had learned along the way, the importance of perspective, the necessity of empathy, and the strength that comes from confronting truths, no matter how challenging. The complexity of family, secrecy, and personal agency had become a source of empowerment rather than merely confusion or pain. Returning home, I began to make plans for how to integrate this new reality into my life. I considered my career, my personal development, and the relationships that mattered most to me. I recognized that while my mother's choices had shaped my childhood, they did not have to limit my adulthood. I could embrace both love and truth, reconcile the past while shaping the future, and engage meaningfully with the world I had been denied for so long. I also thought about my mother in practical terms. I realized that while I loved her, I would need to establish boundaries. Her protection had come with strings, fear, secrecy, and control, and I now understood the necessity of defining my own agency. Conversations about truth, responsibility, and autonomy became central to our evolving relationship. I wanted her guidance but also independence, and slowly, with patience and empathy, we began to navigate that balance. By the end of this period, I felt stronger, more grounded, and more aware of my own capacity for agency and discernment. The revelations about my heritage, the interactions with Jonathan, and the reconciliation with my mother had forged a deeper understanding of both human imperfection and the potential for growth. I realized that betrayal and love could coexist, that secrecy could coexist with protection, and that the responsibility for my own life ultimately rested with me. The months that followed were a blend of discovery, reconciliation, and growing confidence. I had learned to navigate the delicate balance between my mother's protective instincts, Jonathan's cautious guidance, and my own desires and ambitions. Life felt fuller, more complex, yet I embraced the complexity as a challenge and an opportunity. Each day offered lessons, sometimes about trust, sometimes about resilience, and sometimes about the quiet power of self-awareness. Jonathan and I spent more time together, not just discussing the legacy I had inherited, but exploring the values and principles he held dear. I observed the care with which he approached his employees, his investments, and his philanthropic work. Unlike the distant, intimidating figure I had imagined, he revealed himself as someone deeply conscientious, capable of empathy, and committed to fairness. Through our interactions, I began to see the man not merely as a father figure, but as a mentor and collaborator, someone who valued honesty and character above all else. At the same time, I worked to reconcile my relationship with my mother. We had moved from tentative conversations to more meaningful dialogues. She shared stories of her past, her fears, and the reasons she had kept my adoption a secret. Listening to her, I realized that her actions were rooted not in malice, but in a complex mixture of love, anxiety, and determination to protect me from forces she could not control. I forgave her, not because her decisions had been flawless, but because I understood the human motives behind them. Forgiveness, I discovered, was not a single act but a process, a willingness to see the whole picture rather than isolated actions. As I began to embrace this dual relationship with my mother and my biological father, I also faced the challenge of defining my identity on my own terms. I reflected on my career, my personal goals, and the life I had built independently. While Jonathan's world offered privilege, influence, and resources, I recognized that my own achievements, resilience, and values were equally important. I needed to integrate these aspects to create a life that honored both my past and my present. One afternoon, I attended a small family gathering that Jonathan had organized, inviting close friends and associates who had been part of his life for decades. Observing the interactions around me, I felt a mix of awe and apprehension. These were people who had wielded influence, cultivated networks, and shaped industries. Yet their warmth, curiosity, and genuine interest in me underscored a vital lesson. Connection and respect are built through authenticity, not inheritance alone. During the gathering, I engaged in conversations about charitable projects, business initiatives, and community outreach. Jonathan watched from a distance, offering subtle encouragement, but allowing me the space to interact freely. I realized that this was another form of guidance, teaching me to navigate social and professional landscapes with confidence, discernment, and poise. I began to see the potential for collaboration, for using the resources at my disposal to make meaningful impact beyond personal gain. Amidst the external engagements, I dedicated time to introspection. I thought about the emotions that had accompanied each stage of this journey: shock, curiosity, anger, gratitude, fear, and hope. I acknowledged the layers of betrayal I had felt, the wounds that secrecy had inflicted, and the resilience that had allowed me to persevere. Each reflection reinforced my understanding that personal strength emerges not from isolation, but from confronting challenges, embracing complexity, and exercising informed choice. One evening, I returned to my apartment after a long day of meetings and city exploration. Sitting by the window, watching the sunset reflect off the skyline, I reflected on the subtle but profound shifts in my sense of self. I was no longer simply the daughter of my mother, shaped by her love and secrecy. I was Emily Thompson, a woman capable of navigating complex relationships, making informed decisions, and embracing the opportunities that life had presented. The realization was empowering, a confirmation that identity is not fixed, but shaped through awareness, choice, and action. As the months progressed, I also began to take steps toward formalizing my relationship with Jonathan. We discussed boundaries, expectations, and mutual responsibilities. He respected my autonomy, consistently emphasizing that our connection should be rooted in choice, honesty, and shared values. The dynamic evolved from initial curiosity to genuine partnership, a relationship defined not by obligation, but by mutual respect and understanding. Concurrently, I strengthened my bond with my mother. While challenges remained, particularly around lingering fears and habits formed over decades of protective parenting, our conversations became richer and more transparent. I shared insights from my time with Jonathan, my reflections on identity, and my goals for the future. She listened, sometimes offering guidance, sometimes simply observing, but always with love. The balance of support and independence became clearer, highlighting the capacity for reconciliation even after years of secrecy and emotional distance. Professionally, I began exploring opportunities to leverage my unique position. Jonathan's network offered access, but I was determined to maintain my integrity and independence. I took on projects that aligned with my values, collaborated with mentors who emphasized ethical leadership, and sought to make an impact not through wealth alone, but through meaningful contributions. The process was exhilarating, challenging, and at times intimidating, but it reaffirmed my belief that agency, informed choice, and resilience define one's path more than circumstances alone. In quiet moments, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The discovery of my adoption, the meeting with Jonathan, the reconciliation with my mother, all were chapters in a larger story of self-discovery, empowerment, and transformation. I realized that while betrayal and secrecy had shaped the early parts of my life, the present offered the tools, understanding, and support to build a future of my choosing. One particularly poignant day, I sat in Jonathan's study reviewing documents related to charitable initiatives he had spearheaded. I found myself contemplating ways I could contribute meaningfully, programs that empowered youth, projects that supported education, and initiatives that bridged gaps in opportunity. The realization struck me that inheritance, while significant, was secondary to the responsibility and potential it carried. True legacy, I understood, is measured not by wealth alone, but by the positive influence one imparts to others. As the day turned to evening, Jonathan joined me, observing my engagement with the materials. "You've got vision, Emily," he said softly. "Not just because of opportunity, but because of insight, curiosity, and empathy. Those qualities matter more than anything else." His words resonated deeply, reinforcing the importance of agency, integrity, and intentionality. I felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that my journey was no longer about discovery alone. It was about action, contribution, and meaningful engagement. Returning to my apartment later that night, I contemplated the intertwined threads of family, secrecy, revelation, and choice. I had confronted betrayal, navigated complex emotions, and embraced opportunities previously hidden. The journey had been fraught with challenge, yet it had also illuminated the depth of resilience, the capacity for forgiveness, and the potential for growth. I realized that identity is not a static state, but a dynamic process shaped by experience, reflection, and intentional action. In the weeks that followed, I continued to balance relationships with my mother and Jonathan while pursuing my own ambitions. I engaged in discussions about philanthropy, business ethics, and social impact, drawing upon the insights I had gained from both figures. Each decision was informed by reflection, values, and a desire to act with integrity. The sense of empowerment I felt was profound, an affirmation that the discovery of hidden truths, while initially destabilizing, could ultimately lead to clarity, agency, and meaningful purpose. By the end of this period, I felt a profound transformation. The girl who had grown up under the careful watch of a protective mother had become a woman capable of navigating complexity, making informed choices, and embracing opportunities with confidence and discernment. The journey had been difficult, marked by emotional turbulence and moments of uncertainty, but it had also forged resilience, insight, and a deep understanding of both human imperfection and potential. The final chapter of this journey was not marked by grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but by quiet understanding, intentional choices, and the empowerment that comes from fully embracing one's identity. I had spent months navigating the complex emotional terrain of adoption, secrecy, and discovery, and I now found myself standing at the threshold of a life that blended past revelations with future possibilities. Returning to Ohio for the first time after months in New York, I carried with me a renewed sense of self. The town felt familiar, yet my perspective had shifted. Every street, every shop, every corner now resonated differently because I had grown, not just in knowledge, but in emotional intelligence, resilience, and self-awareness. I no longer viewed my life solely through the lens of what had been hidden from me. I could see the broader picture, understanding the context of choices, the interplay of fear and protection, and the capacity for human imperfection. I visited my mother first, a visit that felt more like a reunion than a simple homecoming. We embraced with a depth of emotion that had previously been absent, a blend of relief, understanding, and tentative reconciliation. I thanked her for her love, acknowledged the pain caused by secrecy, and expressed my desire to move forward with both honesty and empathy. She listened, her eyes glistening, and I saw a mixture of pride, regret, and hope. For the first time, our relationship felt balanced, not defined by secrecy or fear, but by mutual respect and a shared commitment to understanding. Over the next few days, I reflected on the breadth of my experiences, the discovery of Jonathan, the exploration of his world, the lessons about integrity, responsibility, and choice. I realized that while material wealth had been part of the revelation, the more profound inheritance was understanding. Jonathan had offered me insight, mentorship, and connection, but he had never imposed control. He had demonstrated that true power lies not in possession, but in the capacity to guide, support, and respect autonomy. I also confronted lingering feelings of betrayal. My mother's secrecy had left scars, but I had learned that anger and resentment, while valid, could not define my future. I wrote letters to both her and Jonathan, letters that articulated gratitude, acknowledgement, and the lessons learned. These letters were not merely exercises in closure. They were affirmations of my agency and the deliberate choices I was making about how to engage with family, legacy, and personal ambition. Professionally, I began to integrate the lessons from my time with Jonathan into my own career. I took on projects that aligned with my values, leveraged the networks and knowledge I had gained responsibly, and sought to make meaningful contributions to communities and causes that mattered to me. I realized that empowerment is not simply about opportunity. It is about intentional action, ethical decision-making, and the courage to act in accordance with one's principles. One afternoon, Jonathan invited me to a quiet lunch in Manhattan. The conversation was relaxed, filled with reflections on the journey we had shared and the lessons I had absorbed. He spoke candidly about his own experiences, about mistakes, missed opportunities, and the importance of cultivating relationships with integrity. Listening to him, I understood that the bond we were building was not defined by inheritance or obligation, but by trust, mutual respect, and shared values. In private moments, I also considered the broader implications of my adoption and discovery. Identity, I realized, is not a static concept. It is shaped by history, experience, relationships, and choices. I had inherited not just wealth, but insight, perspective, and the responsibility to act with intentionality. I embraced this realization, recognizing that my future would be defined not by what had been hidden from me, but by the choices I made, the actions I took, and the integrity with which I approached life. As Thanksgiving approached, I felt a profound sense of closure and empowerment. The holiday, once a symbol of exclusion and secrecy, now represented possibility, connection, and reconciliation. I chose to celebrate with my mother, honoring the love and sacrifices that had shaped my early life, while also acknowledging the truths that had been withheld. I also communicated with Jonathan, including him in the celebration in a manner that respected both his presence and the family dynamics I was navigating. The day was filled with warmth, laughter, and meaningful conversation, a testament to the growth, understanding, and balance that had emerged from months of introspection and discovery. Through this process, I learned that betrayal does not have to define one's life. Secrecy, omission, and fear may shape experiences, but they do not dictate the future. Empowerment comes from reflection, understanding, and the courage to engage honestly with both the past and the present. I had confronted difficult truths, reconciled conflicting emotions, and established meaningful connections with both my mother and Jonathan. These experiences had forged resilience, insight, and a sense of agency that would guide me indefinitely. In the quiet of that Thanksgiving evening, as the sun set and family gathered around the table, I felt a sense of equilibrium. I understood the depth of human imperfection, the nuances of love and protection, and the transformative power of truth and transparency. I also recognized my own capacity for action, choice, and integrity. I was no longer merely a passive observer of my life. I was an active participant, capable of shaping my identity, relationships, and legacy with intention and awareness. The journey from discovery to understanding, from betrayal to reconciliation, had been long and emotionally complex. Yet it had also revealed the profound potential inherent in every challenge, the opportunity to grow, to forgive, to build meaningful relationships, and to assert one's agency. I had learned that family is not defined solely by circumstance, but by the effort, honesty, and care invested in relationships. I had learned that identity is not dictated by secrecy or omission, but by the conscious choices one makes in engaging with the world. As I reflected on the months that had passed, the emotional upheaval, the revelations, the reconciliations, I felt a sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the experiences, for the lessons, and for the people who had shaped my journey. Gratitude for the resilience I had cultivated, the empathy I had strengthened, and the clarity I had gained. Most importantly, gratitude for the understanding that life's challenges, even those rooted in betrayal and secrecy, can be transformed into sources of strength, insight, and meaningful connection. The final takeaway was clear. The past, with all its secrecy, fear, and complexity, does not define the future. By embracing truth, exercising agency, and engaging with relationships honestly, one can forge a life of integrity, empowerment, and authentic connection. I had discovered not only the father I never knew and the legacy hidden from me, but also the strength within myself to navigate complexity, to act with intention, and to embrace the fullness of my identity. In the end, I was no longer simply the girl whose adoption had been hidden. I was Emily Thompson, a woman who had faced betrayal, uncovered truth, reconciled complex relationships, and claimed her place in the world with courage, wisdom, and integrity. And as the night settled around the Thanksgiving table, I finally felt at peace, knowing that I had reclaimed my story, embraced my inheritance of both love and knowledge, and stood ready to shape a future defined by choice, resilience, and authenticity.